Bum, ba, bum, 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 bum. Okay. We have four more readings to do on the Intro to Philosophy of Mind. This is a symposium of three philosophers whose names we'll get more used to, especially two of them. Uh, we just started the actual Philosophy of Mind course on Thursdays, and we're going to come across Iyer again, and I think Ryle in that course. But here's a conversation between the three of them, or they each give a quick presentation. So we're going to read that, and it's going to give us an even better idea of the sorts of questions that philosophers of mind are thinking about and a few of the approaches that they use. Viscount Samuel. In so short a broadcast, I can only offer badly my own conclusions on the question debated in this most interesting and indeed exciting discussion without attempting any survey of the previous contributions. Okay, so these three guys came in to talk about the question of mind, and I believe that they came in a long series of other people who came from other perspectives. So let's see if there's a note here on that. This symposium was part of a series of broadcasts given over the third program of the BBC in 1950, published by Basil Blackwell, Oxford, as The Physical Basis of Mind. It is here represented. Yes, so there were other thinkers who came before from different perspectives, probably psychological, religious, theological, things like that. Okay. Mm. The discussion has been an approach from the side of physiology to one of the oldest and most fundamental of the problems of philosophy, the relation between mind and matter. For centuries, philosophers have different school of different schools have made strenuous efforts to resolve one into the other. Some have sought to show that mind is nothing more than an emanation in the course of evolution from matter. Others that matter is nothing more than a concept of mind, which alone is real. Those efforts have been unsuccessful. Neither view has won general assent. The materialists appear to ignore the obvious lesson of daily experience. We see every moment events which cannot be accounted for by derivations, however subtle, from physical or chemical processes. Watch a chess player deliberating for a quarter of an hour whether to move his queen here or a pawn there. At last, he stretches out his hand and does the one or the other, or he may do neither. Using his vocal organs, he may say, I resign this game. The physiologist may reveal the nervous and muscular mechanism which operates the hand or the tongue, but not the process which has decided the player's action. Or consider a novelist making up a story, a musician writing a symphony, a scientist engaged in a mathematical calculation, or indeed something much simpler, a bird building its nest and choosing the right materials for each stage, or a cat waiting for a pause in the traffic before crossing the street. All these and all such are engaged in some process that is different in kind from electrical attractions and repulsions, or from the processes that unite particles into atoms, atoms into molecules, molecules into objects, and move them about relatively to one another. The idealists do not account for the fact, which we are bound to accept from astronomy, geology, and anthropology, if we think at all, and if we accept anything at all, that the stars and the planets and this earth existed eons before man existed, that the universe carried on its activities then, and may properly be assumed to carry them on now, independently of man's perceiving and observing, timing and measuring. The material universe cannot, therefore, be a product of human thought. If it is said that matter may still be an emanation of mind, the mind of God, that is merely an evasion, removing the problem outside the scope of the argument. The whole effort to resolve mind into matter, or else matter into mind, is the outcome of what T.H. Green called the philosophical craving for unity. But a craving is something irrational, and we had better beware of becoming addicts. What ground is there for requiring any such unification, either of the one kind or of the other? An essential duality in nature is the alternative that is left. For those who have proceeded on this assumption, or on that assumption, it has been natural and usual to regard the living conscious body as the province of mind and the outside material universe as the province of matter. This series of addresses, which is now concluding, has been most valuable in showing that this is an error. It has put the boundaries between the two in the wrong place. The eminent scientists who have taken part in it have clearly established that the acceptance of sense stimuli, the transmission of their effects along the nerve fibers, and their activation of different parts of the brain are mechanical. Whether the approach is from biophysics or biochemistry, anatomy, or pathology, the conclusion is the same. These are material activities obeying mechanical laws. Dr. Russell Bryan, who spoke on speech and thought, tells us that, quote, all stimuli reach the brain as electrical patterns. Professor Lagros Clark and others describe with great clarity the mechanism of the nervous system as a whole. We must conclude that these processes, although inside the body, are not essentially different from the physical processes that are going on outside. Rather, they are a continuation. When we feel an electric shock, the nerve fibers that carry the current are performing a function similar in kind to that of the copper wire between the battery and the hand. When we hear a sound, the mechanism of the auditory organs, including the relevant part of the brain, is specialized, no doubt, but is not fundamentally of a different order from the airwaves that had carried the sound. It follows that the meeting place between mind and matter in our own experience is not where we had supposed it to be. It is not at the boundary between body and not body, but is internal. That, however, does not solve the problem. It merely shifts it. Some meeting place there must be to account for the brain mind relation. And we are bound to assume that although the two are of different orders, they must have something in common because there is a meeting place, because the two interconnect and interact, because body, including brain, does in fact condition and influence mind, and mind does in fact condition and influence body. The painter or sculptor is conditioned and influenced by his materials, the composer by the musical instruments that exist in his time, the architect by the available building materials, the craftsman by his tools, the captain and crew by their ship. But also, the artist, composer, architect, craftsman, or navigator chooses the things that he will use and decides the purposes that they will serve. So with mind and body. This discussion has helped to clarify the whole problem of establishing the fact that the meeting place is not at the point where external stimuli impinge upon the nervous system. It is at the points where mind accepts and utilizes the sense data offered by the brains. But the discussion has not been able to answer the question what it is that takes over at those points. And therefore, it could not even begin to consider how the connection may be made. Here again, our scientists are substantially agreed. Professor Lagros Clark said at the end of his broadcast, no more than the physiologist is the anatomist able to even to suggest how the physicochemical phenomena associated with the passage of nervous impulses from one part of the brain to another can be translated into a mental experience. Dr. Penfield compares the mechanism of nerve cell connections to a telephone switchboard. He asks, what is the real relationship of this mechanism to the mind? He says that, quote, there is a difference between automatic action and voluntary action, that something else finds its dwelling place between the sensory complex and the motor mechanism, that there is a switchboard operator as well as a switchboard. Sir Charles Sherrington has written elsewhere that our being should consist of two fundamental elements offers, I suppose, no greater inherent improbability than that it should rest on only one, unquote. Again, quote, we have to regard the relation of mind to brain as still not merely unsolved, but still devoid of a basis for its very beginning. And he has ended his stimulating contribution to the present discussion by saying, quote, Aristotle 2000 years ago was asking, how is the mind attached to the body? We are asking that question still. That, it seems, is where we are now at a standstill. Until science and philosophy can help us to move on from that position, we cannot hope that the universe will, for us, be rationalized. A couple of quick comments, although we're trying to move swiftly through this. He's not offering a solution to the problem, but he's establishing very clearly that the problem still exists, right? Imagine if you had just heard a whole bunch of scientists explaining how the brain works and people thinking, oh, they've understood the mind brain interaction. He goes, we haven't said word one about that yet, and it's still a problem. We can go back and we can look at his arguments against monistic idealism. We can look at his arguments against monistic materialism and see how well they stand up. At times, he almost seems like he's hinting towards one of two positions in his own mind, which he doesn't fully get into. But either he could be a pseudo problemist. It doesn't seem like he didn't say one sentence to suggest he was, but it looked like he might be setting things up that way. Or a harmonist, a person who believes in two worlds that just happen to overlap each other perfectly. But he doesn't actually give us his position. However, it's a good introduction to the philosophical contribution to this conversation. So then we move on to A.J. Iyer. I wonder if Lord Samuel has made it completely clear exactly what the problem is that the philosophers are here called upon to solve. The scientists who have spoken in this series have shown very fully and convincingly how various mental processes, thinking, feeling, perceiving, remembering, are causally dependent upon processes in the brain. But to some of them, at least, the character of this connection still appears mysterious. Thus, Sir Charles Sherrington remarks that it is a far cry from any electrical reaction in the brain to suddenly seeing the world around one, with all its distances, colors, and chiaroscuro. The Professor Adrian confesses to the same misgivings, quote unquote, when he says that, quote, the part of the picture of the brain which may always be missing is, of course, the part which deals with the mind, the part which ought to explain how a particular pattern of nerve impulses can produce an idea, or the other way around, how a thought can decide which nerve cells are to come into action. Unquote. If this is a genuine problem, it is hard to see why further information about the brain should be expected to solve it. For however much we amplify our picture of the brain, it remains still a picture of something physical. And it is just the question how anything physical can interact with something that is not, that is supposed to constitute our difficulty. If what we are seeking is a bridge across a seemingly impassable river, it will not help us merely to elevate one of the banks. It looks, indeed, as if some of the previous speakers were hoping to discover in the brain something describable as the locus of the mind, the location of the mind. Remember what we read the other day, Aquinas saying, to all learned people, the statement, incorporeal things have no location is self evident. Just a quick callback to one of our other things. Okay. It looks indeed as though they're looking for the locus of the mind, as if mind and brain could be conceived as meeting at a point in space, or at somehow or as somehow shading into one another. But to me, this is not even an intelligible hypothesis. What would it be like to come upon this junction? By what signs would you recognize it if you found it? Descartes had the same problem, and he met it by suggesting that mind and body come together in the pineal gland. But how this conjecture could conceivably be tested, he did not explain. The reason he had the problem, the reason why we have it still, is that matter and mind were conceived by him from the outset as distinct orders of being. It is as if there were two separate worlds, such that every event had to belong to one or other of them, but no event could belong to both. But from these premises, it follows necessarily that there can be no bridge or junction. For what would the bridge consist of? Any event that you discovered would have to fall on one or the other side. So if there is a difficulty here, it is not because our factual information is scanty, but because our logic is defective. Perhaps this whole manner of conceiving the distinction between mind and matter is at fault. In short, our problem is not scientific, but philosophical. Okay, so this is fun. We had a whole bunch of scientists talking about the brain. The philosophers come in and they want to spend 99% of their words making sure everybody understands that the problem has not been solved and that it is properly in their domain to make progress on it, which they're right about both points, I think. So let's move on. Let us consider then what can be meant by saying that a particular pattern of nerve impulses produces an idea or that a thought decides which nerve cells are to come into action. What are the facts on which such assertions are based? The facts are that the physiologist makes certain observations and that these observations fall into different categories. On the one hand, there are the observations that lead him to tell his story about nerve cells and electrical impulses. That is to say, the story is an interpretation of of the observations in question. On the other hand, there are the observations which he interprets by saying that the subject of his experiment is in such and such a mental state, that he is thinking or resolving to perform some action or feeling some sensation or whatever it may be. It is then found to be the case that these two sorts of observations can be correlated with one another, that whenever an observation of the first type can be made, there is a good reason to suppose that an observation of the second type can also be made. For example, when the scientists make observations which they interpret by saying that such and such nerve cells are undergoing such and such electrical disturbances, they can also make observations which are interpreted by saying that the subject is having sensations of a certain type. Again, when they are able to make such observations as are interpreted by saying that the subject is resolving to perform some action, they can also make further observations which are interpreted by saying that certain impulses are passing through certain of his nerve fibers. It seems to me that when it is asserted that the two events in question, the mental and the physical, are causally connected, that the pattern of nerve impulses, quote unquote, produces the sensation, or that the thought decides, quote unquote, which nerve cells are to operate. All that is meant, or at least all that can properly be meant, is that these two sets of observations are correlated in the way that I have described. But if this is so, where is the difficulty? There is nothing especially mysterious about the fact that two different sets of observations are correlated, that given the appropriate conditions, they habitually accompany one another. You may say that this fact requires an explanation, but such an explanation could only be some theory from which the fact of this correlation could be deduced. And insofar as the theory was not a mere redescription of the facts which it was intended to explain, it would serve only to fit them into a wider context. We should learn from it that not only were these observations correlated, but certain further types of observations were correlated with them. To ask, quote, or to ask why something occurs, if it is not simply equivalent to asking how it occurs, is to ask what other things are associated with it. Once the facts are fully described, there is no mystery left. If there seems to be a mystery in this case, it is because we are misled by our conceptual systems, not by the facts themselves, but by the pictures which we use to interpret the facts. The physiologist's story is complete in itself. The characters that figure in it are nerve cells, electrical impulses, and so forth. It has no place for an entirely different cast of sensations, thoughts, feelings, and the other personae of the mental play. And just because it has no place for them, they do not intervene in it. The muddle arises from trying to make them intervene, as I am afraid Lord Samuel does, when he gets a confused, indeed an unintelligible story of electrical impulses being transmuted into sensations or of mental processes interleaved with disturbances of the nervous cells. The picture we are given is that of messengers traveling through the brain, reaching a mysterious entity called the mind, receiving orders from it, and then traveling on. But since the mind has no position in space, it is by definition not the sort of thing that can have a position in space. It does not literally make sense to talk of physical signals reaching it, nor are there such temporal gaps in the procession of nerve impulses as would leave room for the mental characters to intervene. In short, the two stories will not mix. It is like trying to play Hamlet, but without the Prince of Denmark, but with Pericles, the Prince of Tyre. But to say that the two stories will not mix is not to say that either of them is superfluous. Each is an interpretation of certain phenomena, And they are connected by the fact that in certain conditions, when one of them is true, the other is true also. My conclusion is then that mind and body are not to be conceived as two disparate entities between which we have to make or find some sort of amphibious bridge, but that talking about minds and talking about bodies are different ways of classifying and interpreting our experiences. I do not say that this procedure does not give rise to serious philosophical problems. How, for example, to analyze statements about the thoughts and feelings of others, or how far statements about people's so called mental processes are equivalent to statements about their observable behavior. But once we are freed from the Cartesian fallacy of regarding minds as immaterial substances, I do not think that the discovery of causal connections between what we choose to describe respectively as mental and physical occurrences implies anything by which we need to be perplexed. Okay, couple of quick notes. He's clearly a pseudo problemist, right? He is the first that we've come across. Also, in our philosophy of mind course on Thursday, very rapidly, we will be getting into Descartes in the historical background and looking at his idea of mental substance. So we don't need to elaborate on it here. Um, what else can we say quickly as we're moving through this? We saw another reference to the idea that incorporeal things have no location. And we saw for the first time somebody make use of that by looking at the implications. What he's actually trying to say here is that, like Spinoza said, we have two languages available to us for describing all the phenomena of the world. There's the chair, and we can talk about the chair as length, breadth, width, located in time and space, impenetrable, reflecting certain colors. We can objectify the chair, and we can talk about the chair as object. But then there is the concept of the chair, which is what we have in our minds. And that affects other concepts of ours. And we have a valuation of the chair, which is a mental thing. It's useful to me. It's in my way, things like that. And what Spinoza said was that we have two languages, the subjective and the objective. And we can describe all of the phenomena of the universe in either language, and there is no translation between the two languages. And then he postulated that perhaps God has 1,000 languages he can use, but two are available to us. Um, What Iyer is saying here goes right along with that. And what he's saying is that, look, if you're trying to bridge the gap between the two, there is no gap between the two. There's just two different ways of looking at the same thing. So he could maybe be a conceptualist who's well, we could pull that list up again here. It'd be worth looking at. See slides. I think it's one of these. Yeah, there we go. So it's possible that he could be a conceptualist in trying to solve this problem. Oops, I went too far because I clicked too quickly. There we go. So he's just looking at one thing from one side and you describe it as concave, and you look at the same thing from the other side, you describe it as convex. If you look at the feelings and thoughts and intentions of a person as subjective things, then you can describe them that way. And if you look at them as neurological signals, you could describe them that way, but they're really the same thing and there's no gap. And that's a little different, but it's we're going to see somebody who gives a clear view of this idea in a moment. So let's just leave him here as a perspectivist. The first gentleman seemed more like a harmonist, but he was looking for the interaction between the two, so that's not clear either. Okay, let's try this last piece right here. Gilbert Ryle, who we'll hear more of soon. The story is told of some peasants who were terrified at the sight of their first railway train. Their pastor therefore gave them a lecture explaining how a steam engine works. One of oh, sorry. One of the peasants then said, "Yes, pastor, we quite understand what you say about the steam engine. But is there really a horse inside? Isn't there? There's really a horse inside, isn't there?" So used were they to horse-drawn carts that they could not take in the idea that some vehicles propel themselves. We might invent a sequel. The peasants examined the engine and peeped into every crevice of it. They then said, "Certainly we cannot see, feel, or hear a horse there. We are foiled. But we know that there is a horse there. So it must be a ghost horse, which, like the fairies, hides from mortal eyes." The pastor objected, "But after all, horses themselves are made of moving parts, just as the steam engine is made of moving parts. You know what their muscles, joints, and blood vessels do. So why is there a mystery in the self propulsion of a steam engine if there is none in that of a horse? What do you think makes the horse's hooves go to and fro?" After a pause, a peasant replied, "What makes the horse's hooves go is four extra little ghost horses inside." Poor simple-minded peasants. Yet just such a story has been the official theory of the mind for the last 3 very scientific centuries. Several, though not all, of the scientists in this series have automatically posed their problem in this very way. I think that Lord Samuel helps or still accepts the whole story, and that Professor Ayer would like to reject it, but does not see how to do so. For the general terms in which the scientists have set their problem of mind and body, we philosophers have been chiefly to blame, though we have been obsessed not by the rustic idea of horses, but by the newer idea of mechanical contrivances. The legend that we have told and sold runs like this: a person consists of two theaters, one bodily and one non bodily. In his theater A, go on the incidents which we can explore by eye and instrument. But a person who a person who incorporates a second theater also incorporates a second theater, theater B. Here, there go on incidents that are totally unlike, though synchronized with those that go on in theater A. These theater B episodes are changes in the states, not of bits of flesh, but of something called consciousness, which occupies no space. Only the proprietor of theater B has firsthand knowledge of what goes on in it. It is a secret theater. The experimentalist tries to open its doors, but it has no doors. Tries to peep through its windows, but it has no windows. He is foiled. We tend nowadays, sorry, I'm going to stop suffering here and just turn on this light so we can read a little bit easier. Stop making you suffer. Oh, okay, that'll work. Okay. We tend nowadays to treat it as obvious that a person, unlike a newt, lives the two lives, life A and life B, each completely unlike, though mysteriously geared to the other. Ingrained hypotheses do feel obvious, however redundant they may be. The peasants in my story correctly thought that a steam engine was hugely different from a cart and automatically, but incorrectly, explained the difference by postulating a ghost like horse inside, a ghost horse inside. So, most of us, correctly thinking that there's a huge difference between a clock and a person, automatically but incorrectly explain these differences by postulating an extra set of ghost works inside. We correctly say that people are not like clocks, since people meditate, calculate, and invent things. They make plans, dream dreams, and shirk their obligations. They get angry, feel depressed, scan the heavens, and have likes and dislikes. They work, play, and idle. They are sane, crazy, or imbecile. They are skillful at some things and bunglers at others. Where we go wrong is in explaining these familiar mechanisms and conditions as the operations of a secondary set of secret works. Everybody knows quite well when to describe someone as acting absent mindedly or with heed, as babbling deliriously or reasoning coherently, as feeling angry but not showing it, as wanting one thing but pretending to want another, as being ambitious, patriotic, or miserly. We often get our accounts and estimates of other people and of ourselves wrong, but we more often get them right. We did not need to learn the legend of the two theaters before we were able to talk sense about people and to deal effectively with them. Nor has this fairly newfangled legend helped us to do it better. When we read novels, biographies, and reminiscences, we do not find the chapters partitioned into Section A, covering the hero's bodily doings, and Section B, covering his mental doings. We find unpartitioned accounts of what he did and thought and felt, of what he said to others and to himself, of the mountains he tried to climb and the problems he tried to solve. Should an examiner mark the paper written by the candidate's hand, but refuse to assess the candidate's wits? Theorists themselves, when actually describing people, sensibly forget Theater A and Theater B. Sir Charles Sherrington paid a well deserved compliment to Professor Adrian, but he did not pay one cool compliment to Professor Adrian A and another warmer compliment to Professor Adrian B. In saying that a person is not to be described as a mind coupled with a body, I am not saying, with some truculent thinkers, that people are just machines, nor are engines just wagons, or live bodies just corpses. What is wrong with the story of the two theaters is not that it reports differences which are not there, but that it misrepresents differences which are there. It is a story with the right characters, but the wrong plot. It is an attempt to explain a genuine difference, or rather a galaxy of differences. But its effect, like that of the peasant's theory, is merely to reduplicate the thing to be explained. It says, the difference between a machine, like a human body on the one hand, and a human being on the other, is that in a human being, besides the organs which we do see, there is a counterpart set of organs which we do not see. Besides the causes and effects which we can witness, there is a counterpart series of causes and effects which we cannot witness. So now we ask, but what explains the differences between what goes on in the theater B of the sane man and what goes on in that of a lunatic? A third theater, theater C? No. What prevents us from examining theater B is not that it has no doors or windows, but that there is no such theater. What prevented the peasants from finding the horse was not that it was a ghost horse, but that there was no horse. Nonetheless, the engine was different from a wagon, and ordinary people are not only from machines, but also from animals, imbeciles, infants, and corpses. They also differ in countless important ways from one another. I may not, I, I have not begun to show how we should grade these differences. I have only shown how we should not grade them. One last word. In ordinary life, save when we want to sound knowing, we seldom use the noun mind or the adjective mental at all. What we do is we talk of people calculating, conjuring, hoping, resolving, tasting, bluffing, fretting, and so on. Nor in ordinary life do we talk of matter or of things being material. What we do is to talk of steel, granite, and water, of wood, moss, and grain, of flesh, bone, and sinew. The umbrella titles mind and matter obliterate the very differences that ought to interest us. Theorists should drop both these words. Mind and matter are echoes from the hustings of philosophy, and prejudice the solutions of all problems posed in terms of them. Okay, what do we think of this? Obviously he thinks the problem only exists because we're conceiving from the very start, and so we're setting up the problem, and it might just be something we could be done with. It's not clear how much he argues that that's the case. He's just he's certainly making some clever observations, don't get me wrong, but, I'm not sure I'd call him a pseudo-problemist exactly. Um, no, he wouldn't be because a pseudo-problemist agrees that there's these 2 different things. Yeah. We might here have 3 different versions of where'd the mouse go? There we go. We might here have, 3 different versions of parallelism. Let's see. What was the other ones? Determinism, expectivist. Oh, you know what? He could be a panpsychist. That might be what he's hinting at. Oh, that's interesting. Right. He does want to get rid of the idea of matter and of mind. Huh. Well, it's not clear. He doesn't flesh it out, what his position is on this. He could be a number of different views that we've looked at before. Could he be an epiphenomenalist? No, I don't think so. Okay. Excuse me. So that leaves us there. I thought that the third author was a pseudo problemist, but he's not exactly. Although he does think that the problem will dissolve if we'll just get our ideas clear first. So it must be the next guy that we read, or one of the next ones that we read, who gives us that position. So this is interesting. These are philosophers responding to a series of scientists who have come out to talk about neurobiology and what we figured out about the brain in 1950. And it's, ooh, grabs your imagination, and wow, they understand what part of the brain lights up when you're doing such and such. And so they had a long series of that. And the philosophers are coming in here to sort of say, okay, that's all awesome and that's really great, but the problem of mind body has not been solved at all by that. And if you think that that's a full story of everything, it's not, except maybe the last guy thinks it is, if you can start using the other terminology at the same time, which doesn't seem clear how you would use it, the subjective terminology. But in any case, they're all agreed that the problem hasn't been solved by that, and that it never could be solved in that era, in that area of just expanding scientific knowledge. And then they each have their own sort of gently hinted at perspectives on how to deal with the problem. Um, so that's interesting enough. It helps us to just sort of have another opportunity to see some of the relationship between science and philosophy. Again, we had said philosophy sort of invents and then rules over the sciences. The scientists are, I think of them as philosophers with added restrictions. They've got these they can only regard as meaningful things with empirical consequences and stuff like that. And so they're restricted more than the rest of the philosophers, but they can do a lot of really useful work for flushing out a lot of questions once we've got the concepts clear enough to make those questions, which are amenable to empirical verification or falsification, possible in the first place. Um, so I think that's interesting. We were trying to quit early. We've been spending so much time going very slowly through all of these, which has been great. I think what we're going to do is we're going to end the stream pretty quickly because we've got some other things to do today, and we're going to go into the after conversation. And maybe we'll do a second reading tonight, but we'll discuss that after. So let's let this go, and then we'll talk about all this.